Imagine a 16-year-old boy dying in terrible agony while those around him hide the truth about what happened to him in his final months. This teenager was Edward VI, King of England and son of the legendary Henry VIII. And what they did to him before his death would truly horrify any modern person. We're used to thinking of monarchs as people drowning in luxury and power. But Edward VI's story turns these assumptions upside down. Here we see a child who became a hostage to adult political ambitions, a victim of religious conflicts, and possibly the target of one of the most cynical crimes in the history of the English monarchy. Why is this story relevant today? Because it shows how power and political interests can turn childhood into a nightmare and human life into a bargaining chip. In an era when we increasingly talk about children's rights and protecting minors, Edward VI's story sounds like a warning from the past. Edward VI was born on October 3, 1537, and became the only legitimate son of Henry VIII, who had dreamed of a male heir for decades. To get this heir, the king broke relations with the Roman Catholic Church, executed 2 wives, and turned the entire country's religious life upside down. When Edward finally came into the world, it seemed the Tudor dynasty had secured its future. But fate had other plans. The boy lost his mother, Jane Seymour, just 12 days after birth. She died from postpartum complications. From his very first days, Edward found himself at the center of a power struggle where everyone wanted to use him for their own purposes. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, 9-year-old Edward inherited the throne of one of Europe's most powerful states. But along with the crown, he received something far more terrible. He became a pawn in the cruel game of adults who were ready to do anything for power. The official version states that Edward VI died of tuberculosis in the summer of 1553. But modern historians increasingly question this version. The symptoms of the king's illness, described by eyewitnesses, poorly matched tuberculosis. Moreover, the circumstances of his final months suggest something far more sinister was happening to the young monarch. To understand what really happened to Edward VI, we need to immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of those times. Mid-16th century England was a country of religious upheaval and political instability. Catholics and Protestants waged an irreconcilable struggle for the souls of subjects and control over the state. In this struggle, the young king became not just a symbol of power, but a tool in the hands of those who sought to impose their religious program on the country. Contemporaries described Edward as an intelligent and educated child, but also noted his coldness and cruelty, which seemed unnatural for his age. Where did these character traits come from in a boy who should have become a model Christian monarch? The answer lies in the methods of upbringing to which the future king was subjected from earliest childhood. The education system built around Edward resembled training more than human upbringing. From an early age, the boy was forced to study theology, politics, and military affairs for many hours a day. Any manifestations of childishness or emotionality were harshly suppressed. He was taught that a king has no right to weakness, doubts, or human feelings. But the most terrible thing was that Edward was systematically isolated from normal human interaction. He had virtually no peers with whom he could play and befriend. Instead, he was surrounded by adults who saw him not as a child, but as a political instrument. Every word he spoke was analyzed, every action interpreted from the standpoint of state benefit. This psychological isolation inevitably had to affect the child's psyche. And indeed, as Edward grew older, he became increasingly withdrawn, suspicious, and cruel. He easily signed death sentences, showed religious fanaticism, and seemed completely indifferent to the suffering of others. The birth of Edward VI was the culmination of one of the most dramatic chapters in English monarchy history. When the cry of a newborn boy rang out at Hampton Court Palace on October 3, 1537, bells rang throughout England. Henry VIII had finally obtained what he had destroyed his marriage to Catherine of Aragon for, broken with Rome for, and executed Anne Boleyn for, a legitimate male heir. But the price of this long-awaited event was monstrous. The birth was difficult, and Jane Seymour, the king's third wife, paid for the prince's appearance with her own life. She died of postpartum sepsis on October 12th, when Edward wasn't even 2 weeks old. Thus, from his very first days of life, the future king was left without the maternal love and care that every child so desperately needs. Henry VIII, having obtained his desired son, almost immediately turned him into a state project. The king understood that his own health was deteriorating and was obsessed with the idea of preparing the perfect heir. But his ideas about the perfect monarch were distorted by paranoia, cruelty, and religious fanaticism that defined his own reign. Already at the age of several months, Edward was surrounded by an army of nurses, teachers, and courtiers, each of whom had strictly defined duties. None of them had the right to show ordinary human attachment to the child. All contact with the prince was regulated by special instructions that resembled military regulations more than rules for caring for an infant. The upbringing system developed for Edward was based on principles that today we would call psychological abuse. From an early age, the boy was taught that he was not an ordinary child, but a future king who had no right to weakness, doubts, or emotions. Any manifestations of childishness, tears, tantrums, desire to play were immediately stopped as unworthy of his high position. One of the prince's main tutors was Richard Cox, an exceptionally educated man, but fanatically devoted to the Protestant faith. Cox developed an educational program for Edward that would have been exhausting even for an adult. Already at age 4, the boy had to study Latin, Greek, theology, history, and mathematics for 8 hours a day. But the most terrible thing was not the volume of knowledge they tried to cram into a child's head, but the teaching methods. Cox and his assistants used a system of harsh punishments for any mistakes or signs of inattention. The boy could be deprived of food, forced to kneel for hours, or subjected to public humiliation in front of other students. Physical punishment was commonplace in the prince's upbringing. The rod was considered a necessary tool of pedagogy, and Edward was beaten not only for academic failures, but for any attempts to behave like an ordinary child. If he tried to play instead of studying, laugh too loudly, or show affection for any of the servants, this was immediately punished with painful blows. Special attention was paid to the prince's religious education. Cox was a convinced Protestant and sought to raise Edward as a fanatical fighter against Catholicism. The boy was forced to memorize long Protestant sermons, study the works of reformers, and participate in religious services that could last for several hours. At the same time, the child was constantly told that Catholics were enemies of God and England who needed to be ruthlessly destroyed. Edward had to understand that his main mission as king was to finally eradicate the Catholic faith in his domains. These ideas were hammered into the child's head with such persistence that the boy began to perceive religious intolerance as natural and right. The prince's social isolation was almost complete. He had no opportunity to communicate with children his own age, play ordinary children's games, or simply be alone with himself. Every minute of his life was controlled by adults who evaluated his behavior from the standpoint of state benefit. Even Edward's food was subject to strict control. He was fed on schedule, in specific portions, and any food preferences or whims were ignored. The boy had to eat what was considered useful for his health and development, regardless of his own desires. The psychological consequences of such upbringing manifested very early. Already at 5 or 6 years old, Edward demonstrated behavior that modern psychologists would call signs of serious emotional disorders. He was withdrawn, suspicious, and showed sadistic tendencies toward animals and servants. Particularly alarming was the boy's attitude toward physical pain, both his own and others. He learned to endure punishment without tears or screams, but at the same time took pleasure in watching others suffer. Contemporaries noted that the prince could watch public executions for hours without showing the slightest signs of sympathy for the victims. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, 9-year-old Edward inherited not only the crown, but also psychological trauma that could no longer be healed. The boy who should have become a wise and just ruler had turned into a cold, cruel, and fanatical teenager incapable of normal human relationships. The tragedy was that all this suffering was completely pointless. The upbringing system to which Edward was subjected not only failed to make him a better king, but destroyed him as a human being. Instead of a wise ruler, England got a psychologically crippled teenager who saw cruelty and fanaticism as the only ways to govern the state. On February 20th, 1547. One of the most unusual coronations in English history took place at Westminster Abbey. On the throne sat a 9-year-old boy whose feet barely reached the step, and St. Edward's crown was so heavy that it had to be specially lightened for a child's head. But the most terrible thing was not the new monarch's age, but that from the very first day of his reign he became a puppet in the hands of ruthless political schemers. Formally, Edward VI was the absolute monarch of one of Europe's most powerful states. But in reality, power in the country was seized by the Regency Council, which was supposed to govern the state until the king reached majority. This council became an arena of merciless struggle between various court factions, each of which sought to use the young king for their own interests. The chief regent was Edward Seymour, brother of the late Queen Jane, and therefore the king's uncle. He assumed the title of Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, but his power was unstable from the beginning. Other council members did not want to submit to his sole rule and plotted against him, using their influence on the king as their main weapon. For little Edward, this power struggle became a source of constant stress and psychological pressure. Every day, various courtiers came to him, trying to win him over to their side, telling him about their rivals' crimes and demanding certain decisions. The boy, who didn't yet understand the full complexity of the political game, found himself at the center of a real whirlpool of intrigue and betrayal. Particularly cynical was the treatment of the king by his own uncle. Somerset perfectly understood that control over his nephew was the key to power in the state. So he surrounded Edward with his people and essentially turned him into a prisoner of his own court. The boy couldn't take a step without his uncle's permission, couldn't meet with people Somerset considered undesirable, and was forced to sign documents whose contents he often didn't understand. The king's education system was also subordinated to political goals. His teachers, primarily Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer, used lessons for ideological processing of the young monarch. Edward was convinced that his main mission was to complete the religious reformation started by his father and turn England into a stronghold of Protestantism. At the same time, the boy was constantly told that any resistance to his will was not only state treason, but also a sin against God. Edward was taught that the king was God's representative on earth, and therefore all his decisions had divine sanction. This doctrine gave the young monarch a sense of unlimited power, but simultaneously made him more susceptible to manipulation by advisors. One of the most vivid examples of how the king was used in political games was the story of his uncle Thomas Seymour. This ambitious adventurer, the Lord Protector's younger brother, tried to gain access to the king to turn him against his older uncle. Thomas Seymour secretly met with Edward, gave him gifts, and told him about Somerset's cruelty and greed. These meetings became real psychological torture for the child. On one hand, Thomas Seymour was the only adult who showed him human warmth and attention. On the other hand, the boy understood that he was participating in a conspiracy against his official guardian. When the conspiracy was exposed, Edward was forced to testify against the uncle, who was the only one who treated him as a living person rather than a political instrument. The execution of Thomas Seymour in March 1549 was a real shock for the king. The boy realized that even family ties couldn't protect against political intrigue, and that he himself could become the cause of loved ones' deaths. This experience further hardened his heart and strengthened his conviction that power required ruthlessness. But the most terrible manipulations began after Somerset's fall in October 1549. The new de facto ruler of the country became John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, a man even more cynical and unprincipled than the overthrown Lord Protector. Dudley understood that Edward VI was already old enough to claim real power, so his strategy was to make the king an accomplice in his crimes. Dudley began involving Edward in making cruel decisions, convincing him that only an iron hand could ensure order in the state. The boy signed death sentences, sanctioned confiscation of church property, and approved repressions against Catholics. At the same time, Dudley constantly told him that these measures were necessary for the country's good and pleasing to God. Particularly cynical was the exploitation of the king's religious feelings. Dudley and his accomplices convinced Edward that he was an instrument of divine providence, called to cleanse England of Catholic filth. Every cruel decision was presented as fulfilling God's will, while any doubts or manifestations of mercy were declared devil's temptation. The result of this ideological processing was the transformation of the young king into a religious fanatic, ready for any cruelty for the triumph of Protestant faith. In his diary, which he kept from age 13, Edward described executions, property confiscations, and other repressive measures with cold indifference, as if discussing the most ordinary administrative decisions. The tragedy was that the boy sincerely believed in the righteousness of his actions. The upbringing and ideological processing system to which he was subjected completely distorted his moral orientations. He didn't understand that he was not God's servant, but a tool in the hands of cynical politicians who used him to achieve their own goals. By the end of his reign, Edward VI had become a cruel and fanatical ruler who saw terror and repression as the only methods of governing the state. The boy who could have become a wise and just king was finally destroyed as a person by the very people who should have protected and raised him. If you could look into the royal chambers at Greenwich Palace in the spring of 1550, you would see an amazing scene. 13-year-old King Edward VI of England, with the burning eyes of a fanatic, dictates to his secretary a decree about burning Catholic books throughout the country. The boy who recently played with toy soldiers now coldly plans the destruction of religious heritage millennia old. Edward VI's religious policy became one of the cruelest pages in English Reformation history. But the most horrifying thing was not the scale of repression, but how they used the teenager's religious fanaticism to achieve political goals. The young king was turned into an instrument of merciless terror, convinced that cruelty toward Catholics was a sacred duty. Edward's ideological processing began long before his accession to the throne. His chief tutor Richard Cox and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer methodically instilled in the boy that the Catholic Church was the embodiment of evil on earth. The child was told horrifying stories about papal crimes, shown images of Inquisition tortures, and read Protestant pamphlets full of furious denunciations of Catholic dogmas. This propaganda processing was so intensive that it completely distorted the future king's worldview. Edward began to perceive Catholics not as people with different religious beliefs, but as enemies of God and state who needed to be destroyed by any means. In his childish consciousness formed the image of the ideal ruler as a merciless fighter for purity of faith. When Edward became king, his religious fanaticism received political embodiment. Regent John Dudley, who by then effectively ruled the country, skillfully used the king's moods to conduct radical reforms. Dudley understood that the young monarch would more decisively support cruel measures if they were presented as fulfilling God's will. One of the first victims of Edward's religious fanaticism were Catholic churches throughout England. By the king's order began systematic destruction of church decorations, statues of saints, stained glass windows, and frescoes that had been created for centuries. These works of art, representing enormous cultural value, were burned as heretical symbols or melted down for scrap metal. The king showed particular cruelty toward monasteries. Although most of them had already been closed under Henry VIII, Edward ordered the completion of the monastic system's destruction. Monks and nuns were expelled from their dwellings without means of subsistence. Libraries with priceless manuscripts were burned, and buildings were dismantled for construction materials. The psychological impact of these measures on the king himself was catastrophic. The boy who should have been learning mercy and justice made decisions about destruction and violence every day. This gradually hardened his heart and made him insensitive to human suffering. Particularly telling was Edward's reaction to protests against religious reforms. When popular uprisings broke out in various counties caused by forced introduction of Protestant worship, the king demanded their merciless suppression. The 14-year-old teenager coldly gave orders for mass executions of rebellious peasants. The most tragic episode was the suppression of the so-called Prayer Book Rebellion in Devon and Cornwall in the summer of 1549. Local residents rebelled against forced introduction of new Protestant liturgy in English, demanding return to traditional Catholic services in Latin. Edward perceived this rebellion as a personal insult and demanded its cruel suppression. Royal troops under Lord Russell's command acted with exceptional cruelty. More than 4,000 rebels were killed or executed. Entire villages were subjected to plunder and burning. When Edward was informed about the scale of repression, he expressed satisfaction with the results and rewarded the military commanders for effective action. Even more cynical was the use of royal authority for ideological processing of subjects. By Edward's order, special sermons were to be read in all churches throughout the country, in which Catholic faith was declared diabolical delusion. Priests who refused to deliver these sermons were subjected to imprisonment or exile. Special attention was paid to children's religious education. Edward ordered removal of all Catholic textbooks from schools and their replacement with Protestant catechisms. Children were forced to memorize anti-Catholic texts and inform on parents who secretly adhered to the old faith. Psychological pressure on the king himself intensified every day. His entourage constantly fed his religious fanaticism, presenting any cruelty as a manifestation of piety. The boy was told that the more mercilessly he fought Catholicism, the more he would earn divine blessing. The result of this ideological pumping was complete distortion of the young monarch's moral orientations. Edward began to get sadistic pleasure from repressions against Catholics. In his diary, he enthusiastically described burning of heretical books, destruction of churches, and executions of disobedient priests. Particularly alarming was the king's attitude toward physical torture. When he was informed about torture applied to Catholic priests to obtain confessions of heresy, Edward not only approved these methods, but demanded their intensification. The 15-year-old teenager coldly discussed details of torture procedures and expressed disappointment if victims broke too quickly under torture. The tragedy was that Edward sincerely considered himself a pious Christian, fulfilling the Almighty's will. The ideological processing system to which he was subjected so distorted his ideas of good and evil that he didn't understand the monstrosity of his actions. The boy who could have become a wise and merciful ruler turned into an instrument of religious terror. By the end of his reign, Edward VI had become one of the cruelest monarchs in English history. His religious fanaticism surpassed even the extremes of his father, Henry VIII. But the most terrible thing was that this cruelty was not the result of innate depravity, but the consequence of systematic psychological violence to which the child was subjected by adults who used him in their political games. January 1553. Something strange was happening at Greenwich Palace. 15-year-old King Edward VI, who just a month before had energetically participated in state affairs, suddenly began complaining of inexplicable weakness. But most alarming, his entourage, instead of raising the alarm, behaved surprisingly calmly, as if the king's illness was expected. The official medical history of Edward VI's illness is full of contradictions and mysteries that still make historians doubt the natural character of his death. The symptoms observed in the king during his final months poorly correspond to tuberculosis, the disease traditionally considered the cause of his demise. The first signs of illness appeared in Edward in early winter 1552. Venetian ambassador Giacomo Soranzo, who had opportunity to observe the king, noted strange changes in his appearance in his dispatches. The boy began losing weight rapidly. His skin acquired an unhealthy yellowish tint, and his eyes seemed disproportionately large on his gaunt face. But most suspicious was the behavior of court physicians. Instead of bringing Europe's best doctors to treat the king, his entourage limited themselves to consultations with several English doctors who were better known for their loyalty to the ruling faction than for medical talents. The king's chief physician became Dr. George Owen, a man of dubious reputation who had previously served various courtiers and had been involved in several scandalous poisoning cases. It was Owen who insisted that the king's illness was natural and didn't require radical intervention. Meanwhile, Edward's condition continued to deteriorate in the strangest way. He began having vomiting attacks that didn't correspond to classic tuberculosis symptoms. The vomit had a greenish tint, a sign that modern toxicologists associate with certain types of plant-based poisons. Particularly alarming were changes in the king's behavior. The boy who had previously distinguished himself with sharp mind and quick reaction became sluggish and apathetic. He sat motionless for hours, staring at one point and barely responded to courtiers' addresses. Such symptoms are more characteristic of poisoning with certain alkaloids than of pulmonary tuberculosis. But most suspicious was how his illness affected the country's political situation. John Dudley, who by then had received the title Duke of Northumberland and effectively ruled on behalf of the king, began taking strange steps as if preparing in advance for Edward's death. In March 1553, when the king's illness didn't yet seem fatal, Northumberland unexpectedly married his son, Guildford Dudley, to Lady Jane Grey, great-granddaughter of Henry VII. This marriage made no sense from a dynastic standpoint unless Northumberland planned to use Jane Grey as a claimant to the throne after Edward's death. Simultaneously began a campaign to discredit Mary Tudor, the king's half-sister and his lawful heir. Court propagandists spread rumors that Mary was illegitimate and had no right to the throne because of her Catholic faith. This campaign looked extremely strange, considering that Edward VI was still young and could live for many years. Meanwhile, the king's condition became increasingly strange. He began having delirium attacks, during which he spoke of green people pursuing him through palace corridors. Modern toxicology specialists know that hallucinations of exactly this type are characteristic of arsenic poisoning or certain plant poisons. Particularly suspicious was the change in the king's diet regimen. Dr. Owen insisted that Edward receive a special diet consisting of certain herbs and concoctions. At the same time, access to the king was strictly limited. Only Northumberland's most trusted people could see him. In April 1553, French ambassador Antoine de Noailles wrote to Paris about strange rumors circulating at the English court. Some courtiers whispered that the king was receiving some special medicines, after taking which his condition didn't improve but worsened. The most ominous sign was the change in Edward's skin color. By May, his face and hands were covered with dark spots, which doctors explained as tuberculosis progression. However, such skin manifestations are more characteristic of chronic heavy metal poisoning, especially arsenic, which was the favorite weapon of palace poisoners. Even more suspicious was Northumberland's own behavior. The man who previously spent much time with the king now avoided personal meetings with him. When courtiers asked about the reasons for such behavior, the Duke cited the need not to interfere with treatment and give the king peace. In May 1553, Edward's condition sharply deteriorated. He began having convulsions and suffocation attacks, which court doctors tried to explain as tuberculosis complications. But experienced physicians knew that such symptoms were more characteristic of poisoning than pulmonary diseases. Particularly alarming was that during these critical days, several new people gained access to the king who hadn't previously participated in his treatment. Among them was a certain Anna Askew, a woman of dubious reputation who specialized in making various concoctions and was connected to Northumberland's circle. Edward's final weeks of life turned into a real nightmare. The boy suffered from constant pain, his body was covered with sores, and his consciousness was clouded. But most terrible was that, even in such condition, he was forced to participate in political intrigue. Shortly before death, Edward was forced to sign a document excluding his sisters Mary and Elizabeth from throne inheritance and transferring the crown to Jane Grey. The dying teenager, in a state of semi-delirium, put his signature under an act that completely crossed out his father Henry VIII's will. The tragedy was that even fatal illness didn't free Edward from political manipulations. Until his last day, he was used as an instrument in the struggle for power, without regard for his suffering and without attempts to ease his torment. On July 6, 1553, an event occurred at Greenwich Palace that forever changed the course of English history. King Edward VI, who had barely turned 15, breathed his last in his chambers. But the circumstances of his death were so strange that they still provoke disputes among historians and suggest that the young monarch became victim of one of the most cynical crimes in English crown history. Edward's final days became a nightmare, not only for him, but for those few people who still retained human feelings toward him. The boy suffered from terrible pain. His body was racked by convulsions, and bloody foam constantly came from his throat. Contemporaries described his condition as the torments of a sinner in hell. But official doctors continued to claim the illness was developing naturally. Particularly suspicious was Chief Physician Dr. George Owen's behavior in the final weeks. Instead of trying to ease the dying king's suffering, he continued giving him some concoctions, after taking which Edward's condition only worsened. When one courtier dared ask about these medicines' composition, Owen replied that it was a secret recipe known only to him. Even more sinister was the appearance beside the dying king of a woman named Anna Askew. This person, officially presented as a healer specializing in treating rare diseases, was actually connected to various dark court affairs. Contemporaries whispered that Askew knew poison-making secrets and had repeatedly helped eliminate unwanted people. This woman's presence beside the dying king looked particularly cynical against the background of Edward being isolated from all people who could witness the true circumstances of his illness. His personal servants, who had served him for years, were replaced by new people from Northumberland's circle. Even his tutors and teachers were banned from visiting the royal chambers. The most horrifying episode was Edward's final hours. According to eyewitness accounts, shortly before death, the king suddenly regained consciousness and began screaming that he was being poisoned. He begged courtiers not to give him more medicine and asked for a priest to confess before death. But Dr. Owen declared this the raving of a dying man and continued his treatment. Particularly tragic was that in these final hours, there wasn't a single person beside the king who related to him with sincere love. Northumberland appeared in the chambers, only to once again ensure that Edward confirmed his decision about transferring the throne to Jane Grey. The dying teenager, in a state of semi-delirium, nodded his head, and this was taken as final consent. The king's death came around 6 in the morning. Dr. Owen declared cardiac arrest due to tuberculosis complications, but those few people who saw Edward's body immediately after death noted strange details. The deceased's skin had an unnatural greenish tint, and some black liquid seeped from his mouth and nose. Even more suspicious was what happened immediately after death was confirmed. The king's body was immediately removed from the chambers and placed in a closed coffin. Northumberland announced that according to the deceased's will, no autopsy would be performed, and the funeral would take place as soon as possible. But the most cynical began afterward. Edward VI's death was hidden from subjects for 4 whole days. It was officially announced that the king was ill, but his condition was stable. Meanwhile, Northumberland feverishly prepared for proclaiming Jane Grey the new queen and tried to secure army and navy support. During these 4 days, something happened that finally confirmed suspicions about the unnatural character of the king's death. Several servants who participated in preparing the body for burial unexpectedly died from an unclear illness. Officially, their death was explained as infection from the dead king, but this looked extremely suspicious. Particularly strange was the death of Chamberlain Thomas Lovelace, who had faithfully served Edward for many years. This man died just 1 day after helping prepare the king's body for burial. Before death, Lovelace managed to tell his wife several mysterious phrases about the king not dying a natural death, but details of his words remained secret forever. When Edward VI's death was officially announced on July 10th, the people's reaction was unexpected for the conspirators. Instead of meekly accepting Jane Grey as the new queen, uprisings began throughout the country supporting Mary Tudor, the lawful heir to the throne. People instinctively felt that something wrong had happened to their young king. Edward VI's funeral took place at Westminster Abbey and was distinguished by unusual haste. The ceremony was reduced to a minimum, and the coffin remained closed throughout the entire service. Many courtiers noted that such haste was inappropriate for a king's funeral and more resembled an attempt to hide crime evidence. Particularly suspicious was Dr. Owen's behavior after his patient's death. Instead of remaining at court and continuing medical practice, he suddenly disappeared from London. It later emerged that Owen had received a large sum of money from Northumberland and left for France, where he lived under a false name until death. No less mysterious was the fate of Anna Askew, that same healer who was present during the king's final days. Several months after Edward's death, she also disappeared, and no one ever heard of her again. Contemporaries suspected that Northumberland eliminated witnesses who could tell the truth about what happened in the royal chambers. Northumberland's conspiracy collapsed just 9 days after Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. Mary Tudor managed to gather an army and seize power, and all conspiracy participants were arrested. It seemed that now the truth about Edward VI's death would finally come to light. But even after Northumberland's fall, the mystery of the young king's death wasn't revealed. Mary Tudor, who had herself suffered from political intrigue, preferred not to stir up the past. Perhaps she understood that investigating her brother's death circumstances could lead to even greater upheavals in the country. Thus, the mystery of Edward VI's death was buried with his body. But historical evidence that has reached our days allows us to suppose that this 15-year-old boy became victim of one of the most cynical political murders in English history. The tragedy was not only that he died so young, but that even death didn't free him from political manipulations by those who used him throughout his short life. Imagine you're reading a detective novel where the main character is a king, and the murderers wear doctors' and advisors' robes. But this isn't a writer's fiction. This is the real story of Edward VI's death, which has grown so encrusted with myths and legends that separating truth from invention has become almost impossible. Modern historians and medical experts continue to argue about what really happened to the young king, and their conclusions can overturn our understanding of this tragedy. The first and most widespread myth claims that Edward VI died of hereditary tuberculosis that he inherited from his father, Henry VIII. This version seems logical. In the 16th century, tuberculosis was one of the most frequent causes of death, and family predisposition to diseases really exists. But modern analysis of symptoms described by eyewitnesses shows a completely different picture. Dr. Diarmaid MacCulloch from Oxford University, one of the leading specialists in Tudor history, conducted detailed analysis of medical records from that time. His research showed that Edward's illness symptoms, greenish skin color, black vomit, convulsions, and hallucinations correspond much more to chronic arsenic poisoning than to pulmonary tuberculosis. Arsenic was the favorite weapon of palace poisoners precisely because its effects could be stretched over months. Imitating natural illness, the victim gradually weakened, lost the ability to think clearly, and ultimately died in terrible agony. Modern toxicologists know that all symptoms described in Edward exactly correspond to the clinical picture of arsenic intoxication. The second myth concerns motives for the supposed murder. Traditional historiography claims that it was beneficial for Northumberland to preserve Edward VI's life as long as possible, since it was through control over the king that he held power in the country. But this logic ignores the changed political situation by 1553. By this time, Edward VI had already reached an age when he could claim real independence in state governance. Moreover, evidence exists that the young king began showing dissatisfaction with Northumberland's excessive guardianship and wanted to take power into his own hands. For the ambitious duke, such a prospect was unacceptable. Professor Susan Brigden from London University discovered letters in archives that indicate serious conflict between Edward and Northumberland in spring 1553. The king expressed dissatisfaction that he wasn't allowed to participate in making important decisions and demanded greater independence. This created a direct threat to Northumberland's position. The third myth relates to supposed crime perpetrators. The popular version accuses Dr. Owen of poisoning, but modern research shows he was more likely a pawn in someone else's game than the main organizer. The real perpetrators acted much more sophisticatedly. Analysis of court documents shows that in the king's final months of life, his nutrition was handled by a special group of people directly subordinate to Northumberland. Poison could be administered in small doses as part of daily food or medicines, making poisoning practically invisible to those around. Particularly suspicious looks the role of Anna Askew, that same healer who appeared beside the king in his final weeks of life. Modern research has shown this woman wasn't a random figure. She had connections with continental alchemists and possibly possessed toxicological knowledge that significantly exceeded English medicine's level at that time. The fourth myth concerns surrounding people's reaction to the king's illness and death. The traditional version claims no one suspected the unnatural character of what was happening. But archival documents paint a completely different picture. Venetian and French diplomats who carefully followed the situation at the English court repeatedly expressed suspicions in their dispatches about the true causes of the king's illness. Giacomo Soranzo wrote to Venice that Edward's symptoms didn't correspond to any known disease, and his entourage's behavior looked extremely suspicious. Even more telling were common people's reactions. When the king's death was announced, rumors about poisoning immediately spread through London. The people instinctively felt that something wrong had happened to their young king. These rumors were so persistent that the new authorities had to take special measures to suppress them. Modern criminalists studying the historical case of Edward VI draw attention to classic signs of murder conspiracy: isolating the victim from outside observers, appearance of new people in the immediate circle, haste in concealing evidence, elimination of witnesses. All these elements are present in the young king's death story. Particularly telling is analysis of the temporal sequence of events. Northumberland's political steps, his son's marriage to Jane Grey, changing the will, preparing to seize power, began long before Edward's illness took a critical character. This indicates that the illness outcome was planned in advance. Medical examination conducted by modern specialists based on preserved symptom descriptions showed high probability of poisoning. Dr. Duckner, Robert Hutchison from Edinburgh University, a specialist in historical toxicology, concluded that Edward VII's illness clinical picture corresponds 90% to chronic poisoning with arsenic compounds. Experts note that the poisoning was conducted extremely professionally. The poison dose was calculated to stretch the dying process over several months, allowing organizers to prepare for consequences and create the appearance of natural death. Psychological analysis of participants' behavior also confirms the murder version. Northumberland demonstrated classic signs of crime organizer behavior: avoiding contact with the victim, nervousness, haste in decision-making. His actions after the king's death more resembled attempts to hide evidence than natural grief for the deceased monarch. Modern historians increasingly conclude that Edward VI's death was the result of a carefully planned political murder. This crime became the culmination of a multi-year process of turning a living child into a political instrument. The tragedy lies not only in the young king being killed, but in his murder becoming the logical conclusion of that system of violence and manipulation to which he was subjected throughout his short life. Edward VI's story ends on a summer day in 1553, when the 15-year-old king breathed his last in his chambers. But the legacy of this tragedy continues to live today, reminding us of the monstrous consequences that can result from turning a child into a political instrument. This story isn't just a historical curiosity, but a dark warning about the price of power and the nature of human cruelty. What really happened to Henry VIII's son? Modern research allows us to reconstruct a picture of systematic psychological and possibly physical destruction of a child who had the misfortune to be born heir to the English throne. From his first days of life, Edward became a hostage to adult political ambitions, who saw in him not a human being, but a means of achieving their own goals. The upbringing system to which the future king was subjected represented a sophisticated form of psychological abuse. The boy was deprived of maternal love, childhood joys, human warmth, and turned into a cold machine for making political decisions. The result was the formation of a personality incapable of empathy, mercy, and human feelings. Religious fanaticism with which Edward's consciousness was saturated became another weapon of his spiritual destruction. The boy was taught to see cruelty as a manifestation of piety and tolerance as sin against God. This perverted value system turned a potentially wise ruler into an instrument of religious terror. Political manipulations to which the king was subjected from the moment of ascending the throne finally destroyed him as a personality. Adults used childish trust and inexperience to achieve their own goals, without regard for the psychological damage they inflicted on the child. Finally, the supposed poisoning of the king became the logical completion of this destruction process. When Edward VI began showing signs of independence and became a threat to his guardians' plans, they decided to physically eliminate him as they eliminate an unnecessary political instrument. Edward VI's tragedy has universal significance, extending far beyond 16th century history. It shows what consequences result from turning children into objects of political manipulation. Modern psychologists know that such forms of violence inevitably lead to serious mental disorders and personality deformation. This story becomes particularly relevant in the context of modern discussions about children's rights and protecting minors. We live in an era when children of politicians, businessmen, and other influential people often become hostages to their parents' ambitions. Edward VI's story reminds us what price a child can pay for these ambitions. Medical aspects of the king's death also have modern significance. Analysis of his illness symptoms shows how difficult it was in the past to distinguish natural death from poisoning. Modern methods of criminology and toxicology allow us to better understand mechanisms of such crimes and protect ourselves from them. Religious aspects of Edward VI's tragedy remain relevant in an era of religious extremism and fanaticism. The story shows how religious beliefs can be used to justify the most monstrous crimes, and how important it is to protect children from ideological processing. Political lessons of this story also retain their relevance. Turning state power into an instrument of personal enrichment and satisfying ambitions is a problem that exists in all times. Edward VI's story shows what tragic consequences this can lead to. Psychological aspects of the tragedy are particularly important for understanding mechanisms of forming authoritarian personalities. Edward VI could have become a cruel tyrant if he had lived longer. His story shows how an upbringing system can create monsters from ordinary children. But the most important lesson of Edward VI's story lies in the necessity of protecting children from being turned into political instruments. Every child has the right to childhood, love, care, and normal development, regardless of their family's social status. Modern international conventions on children's rights are largely a response to tragedies like Edward VI's story. These documents recognize that children are not property of their parents or state, but represent independent value as human personalities. The English boy king's story also reminds us of the importance of independent institutions capable of protecting children from abuse by those in power. In the 16th century, such institutions didn't exist, and the result was tragedy. Modern society must learn from these past mistakes. Finally, Edward VI's tragedy shows the importance of historical memory. Studying such cases helps us better understand the nature of power, mechanisms of political violence, and ways to protect against them. History must not repeat itself. When we look at portraits of Edward VI by Hans Holbein, we see a serious boy with the sad eyes of an adult. This gaze seems directed at us from the past with mute reproach and warning. It reminds us that behind political games and historical events always stand living people, often defenseless and innocent. Memory of Edward VI should serve as a reminder of the necessity to protect children from political manipulation, religious fanaticism, and other forms of violence. Only thus can we guarantee that such tragedies won't repeat in the future. Tell us in the comments, which aspects of this story seemed most important to you? Did you know before about the tragic fate of Henry VIII's son? How, in your opinion, can children be protected from such manipulation in the modern world? Share this article with friends. It's important that as many people as possible know about these dark pages of history and remember their lessons.